The public was already fed up with the system by the end of the Bush administration, and now it was clear that, at least where Wall Street was concerned, President Obama was not going to be any better. The American people had finally had enough, and the outrage that had been building up for years on both the left and the right could no longer be contained.
America is fed up with just being forced into poverty.
Something needs to change. We need an economy for the people and by the people, not by the rich and for the rich.
I've never been actively involved in politics before or any political movement, but this has got me so aggravated I had to put my voice to the public.
The only difference between Las Vegas and Washington, D.C. is at least Vegas has the decency to admit it's full of crooks and hookers.
Both the Bush and Obama administrations went to bat for the banks by telling the American people that they had to be bailed out because they were just too big to fail. But once the outrage reached a fever pitch and people took to the streets demanding that the bankers responsible be brought to justice, the Obama administration added insult to injury by covering for the banks with yet another excuse. The banks weren't just too big to fail, they were too big to jail.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large.
We ended up with a two-tiered system of justice in the United States that was effectively announced by Eric Holder, the Attorney General. And he testified at a congressional hearing that he can't enforce the law against the too-big-to-fail banks and their bankers the way he does to everybody else. If we did that, he said, then the bank might collapse, it will affect the financial system, so we're going to put them in this special category where they get special treatment. Of course, it makes no sense, right? If they actually are in such a critical position where they could wreak economic havoc on every American, then they ought to be actually held to a higher standard, not a lower standard. It's inexcusable people were not prosecuted.
Deregulation and desupervision may have been what allowed bankers to cause the crisis, but it was decriminalization that let them get away with it. Obviously, in order to prosecute individual bankers, there has to be evidence that they in fact committed crimes. And despite what Eric Holder's DOJ would say, there was plenty. In 2010, a commission was formed to try to sort out what actually caused the crisis, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. The FCIC, led by Chairman Phil Angelides, spent over a year compiling evidence specifically to be given to the Department of Justice for the purposes of pursuing prosecutions if they discovered that such action was warranted.
Our job was to be the official government inquiry into what caused the financial meltdown of 2008 on Wall Street. So over a period of a year and a half, we interviewed 700 witnesses, we reviewed millions of pages of documents, we held 19 public hearings, and in January of 2011, we published our report on the causes of the crisis. We found that this was an avoidable crisis. A lot of people on Wall Street kind of put the line out there that this was a perfect storm. We found quite the contrary. This was avoidable. I've seen the evidence where banks knew that they had defective loans. They were putting them in mortgage pools and they were telling the investors that they were good loans. That's not right. That's fraud. And that's activity for which there should be consequence. What I expected was once we turned over that evidence, the Department of Justice would do a bottom-to-top inquiry to find out who engaged in the activity, who approved it, who drove it. We turned over the rock. It was their job to then keep digging. And it's interesting, it appears that on many of our referrals, there are some indications that not much was done.
One of the criminal referrals from the FCIC came courtesy of Richard Bowen in the case involving Citi and Robert Rubin.
I'm very grateful to the Commission to be able to give my testimony today.
The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission thought enough of Bowen's story to call him as one of its first witnesses, and he turned over more than 1,000 pages of documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nothing ever came of it.
Robert Rubin was named in one of our referrals. When he was contacted, he said no one at Justice even talked to him. I find that very troubling. I mean, how is it possible that banks could engage in such massive misconduct, but no bankers were involved? It's not clear to me that the Department of Justice ever marshaled the resources to do the investigation the American people deserved.
As a result of their findings, the Commission made 11 specific criminal referrals against individuals in the financial industry. And while this was only a fraction of the referrals made by Bill Black and the OTS during the S&L crisis, resulting in hundreds of high-level bankers being hauled off to prison in the 1980s, it should have still led to legal consequences for at least some bankers. Yet when it came time for the Obama administration to act, instead of mobilizing prosecutions against the offenders, we got responses like this.
I can't, as President of the United States, comment on the decisions about particular prosecutions. That's the job of the Justice Department, and we keep those things separate so that there's no political influence on decisions made by professional prosecutors. I can tell you just from 40,000 feet that some of the most damaging behavior on Wall Street, in some cases some of the least ethical behavior on Wall Street, wasn't illegal.
When the Department of Justice conducts investigations, we will always follow the law and the facts wherever they lead. Now, sometimes a company's conduct may be wrong, may be hard to defend, but not necessarily be violative of the criminal law. Or sometimes there may be an appearance of criminal wrongdoing that cannot be supported by evidence that would be admitted in a court of law. But when laws indeed appear to have been broken and the evidence supports the allegations, a company's size will never be a shield from prosecution or penalty.
Eric Holder's Department of Justice would stand by their story that, despite all of the criminal referrals from the FCIC, there were simply no prosecutable crimes that occurred on Wall Street related to the crash. It was clear that the math didn't add up. How did the DOJ reach this conclusion without ever conducting any investigations? I needed to make sense of this, which is why I went to speak with Paul Pelletier, one of the highest-level DOJ prosecutors from that era, to see if he could shed any light on what really happened at the Department of Justice in the wake of the financial crisis.
In late 2008, it wasn't a surprise that the financial crisis, not only had it happened, but it was a significant event like America had never seen in its finance world. So as the new administration was coming in, we as prosecutors knew and understand what our job was going to be. We were waiting for the missionization. We were waiting for the leadership to say, go. That never happened. Never happened. Remember, the Obama administration people came in January of 2009. We don't get a task force started until November of 2009. It's almost a year after they get in. And we knew from day one that we need to tackle this today. America was being torn apart.
This inaction by the Obama administration shocked Paul and his colleagues, who even before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report knew that the DOJ had plenty of evidence to spring into action.
Let me give you a few examples of the types of crimes that were known to everybody in the Department of Justice that weren't prosecuted. I think that's the best way of showing you what happened. So if you look, for instance, at Mozillo and Countrywide, the SEC brought an action against Mozillo specifically. And if you read that complaint, it is a litany of crimes, provable lying, cheating, and deceiving crimes that go on for page after page after page. And one of the mind-numbing things to me and many white-collar prosecutors across the country was that within literally 12 weeks, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of California announced that they were not going to prosecute Mazzillo. That's a sin. That sends a message that resonated across the Department of Justice that our leadership, whether it be locally in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Central District of California, or whether it be the Attorney General who let that happen, didn't have the will or the courage to prosecute that case. And that message was deafening.
Once the DOJ did finally start moving nearly a year after the crisis hit, Paul and his colleagues quickly sprang into action. And in fact, it didn't take Paul much time to develop a criminal case against the insurance giant AIG and its head of the financial products division, Joe Cassano. AIG, despite no particular guarantee from the government, would be bailed out by the taxpayers to the tune of $132 billion. Yet it was clear to Paul that AIG was only in this predicament because they had engaged in massive fraud.
I had a makeable case that AIGFP, led by Joe Cassano, was falsely stating to the investors and the general public the true nature of the losses they were suffering in their credit default swap portfolio. The agents and I and my fellow prosecutors all believed we had a prosecutable case. We were told that we could not go forward with that case because I was told that my boss, Lanny Breuer, needed to be guaranteed a victory. And anybody who's a white-collar prosecutor knows that the first thing you do is that you never guarantee anyone a victory, and I had never been asked in my career whether I could guarantee someone a victory in bringing a case. That's not the standard that we use. And so I was not allowed to bring that case.
The head of the criminal division, Lanny Breuer, went on television and said that he lost the ability to sleep at night for fear that he might close down a bank that had engaged in massive fraud. I lose sleep because it's now possible in America to appoint someone like Lanny Breuer who cares about the felons instead of the people of the United States of America.
Is that really the job of a prosecutor, to worry about anything other than simply pursuing justice?
Well, I think I am pursuing justice because if I bring a case against institution A, and as a result of bringing that case, there's some huge economic effect, if it creates a ripple effect so that suddenly counterparties and other financial institutions or other companies that had nothing to do with this are affected badly, it's a factor we need to know and understand.
Now, my answer to that is, okay, if you're worried about prosecuting companies for that, prosecute individuals. Prosecute the CEO of JP Morgan. The institution will survive the prosecution of a single person, so focus on individuals.
Banks don't actually commit crimes. Bankers do. So if you've got to bail out a bank, because a bank, if it collapsed, and because it's interconnected and it's required for the payment system and it's got to fund businesses, etc. If a bank is so important, save the bank, but you don't have to save every banker.
If you prosecute a CEO, all the other CEOs in Fortune 499 other companies, they'll know that that happened. One prosecution of a CEO is worth 30 or 40 deferred prosecution agreements with a corporation.
I was making criminal cases against perpetrators of this fraud. I wasn't allowed to bring those cases. What I can say is that for sure, this financial crisis didn't happen without a boatload of criminal activity, People at every level of business enterprises and every level of Wall Street made that happen. And we prosecuted none of them. Of this administration, the Obama administration, 70% of the career prosecutors in the fraud section left mostly out of frustration. I was one of them. The reason why I left the Department of Justice was because tens of millions of Americans were deeply, deeply, deeply affected by these crimes. Not accidents, by these crimes. We owed it to the American people to at least right the ship in some way, prosecute these people. And we let them down. We did a real disservice to American people. And that's something I thought was just completely unacceptable. And I quit.
Hey all, become that person nobody dares to argue with. Hit like, subscribe, and that little bell button for notifications. Talk to you soon.